Election of 1888. What's this telling you about these presidencies?
Garfield got assassinated.
What it's telling you is, remember I said this is the era of unforgettable presidents? This should be evidence of that. Not a whole lot got done, right? We're talking about corruption, but we're not talking about what these presidents particularly did. The election of 1876, we've actually already done, right? This is Tilden versus Hayes. No. Tilden versus Hayes. This is the election that ends what? This election that ends with the Compromise of 1877, which essentially ends Reconstruction. So Samuel Tilden was a Northern Democrat, and Hayes was the nominee as the Republicans. No one particularly was wild about Hayes. Grant was considering running for a third term, and Congress had a vote to remind him he shouldn't. A 233 to 18 vote, reminding him that 2 terms is really what we do in America. They voted just to make sure he didn't run. They were like, "It's time for you to go away, Beardy." So, I don't know if I said that.
Do you think Sherman would have done better?
Do what?
Do you think Sherman would have done better?
I don't know. Samuel Tilden, who runs, he was the one who ends up going after and putting away Boss Tweed. So he's seen as an anti-corruption guy. And as we said before, the election was not agreed upon. That Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida had electoral votes that were disputed, right? And the compromise leads to Hayes becoming president, the Democrats taking over the South again, and Reconstruction ending. We do remember that, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so there's that. I thought that I would throw in some Hispanic culture, so Garfield E. Arthur. E, if you're curious, does stand for and in Spanish. Did you know that, Swiss McGee? Yes?
She speaks Spanish.
No. Don't you speak Spanish?
She speaks like 5 other.
What language do you speak?
Italian, French, German, Swiss German, English, and
A little bit of Latin.
She
Think
told us that
Caesar
she
rolls
loves
by.
Hitler in German.
Don't say
Do what?
She told us she loves Hitler in German.
I
Like
didn't
said it in
say
German.
that.
Yes, you did.
That's not a thing. That's not a thing you kid around about.
No.
I was just joking.
Well, I know, but I said you don't do that.
Especially
Like we don't. It's like we don't say the N word here, right? Because of slavery,
you don't say
and you don't have Hitler jokes in German. See, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right.
That's just
That's what a basic. If you go to Germany,
Don't say
that's some basic stuff you don't talk about,
They
right?
think that we're idiots
If you go to Harlem and you start saying N words, you don't do that either, right?
They think that we're absolute idiots for allowing the neo-Nazis in this country to go on.
see you for a while.
Anyway.
That's not so true. Okay, let's talk about the election of 1880. All right, election of 1880. The election of 1880. James Garfield, who was a Civil War officer, went up against Winfield Hancock, who was also a Civil War officer. You will never see Winfield Hancock on the AP exam, but just in case you're wondering who Garfield went up against, it was Winfield Hancock, a Democrat. Garfield was a half-breed. What is a half-breed again?
Moderate.
Yeah, he wanted some civil service reform. His vice president was Chester Arthur, who was a stalwart. To give you an indication of just how big the issue of corruption was in politics, Garfield was assassinated in 81, I mean soon after he became president. And the guy that did it, do what? He said, his last name was Guteau, "I am a stalwart and now Arthur is president." He assassinated Garfield over this issue. It was culturally an issue that corruption in politics wasn't necessarily seen as a bad thing to many people like Tiger. Now, what starts to be called for are some reforms, and one of them is going to be a really big deal called the Pendleton Act. The Pendleton Act is one of those laws in American history that doesn't get a lot of press because it's not a particularly sexy law, but it makes huge changes. The Pendleton Act was about civil service reform, and it required increasingly more people who are going to be in the government to pass a competency test. For example, in the 1880s, only 10% of federal employees, 10% of government employees had to be qualified to have a job. By the 1980s, 100 years later, 90% had to be qualified. A lot fewer are political appointees. Like, can the president appoint somebody who's not qualified just because he wants to? Sure. But that's a lot fewer, right? The governor can't appoint people here and there that he wants to. There's a limited number of people he can appoint. The election of 1884. The Republican was a guy named James Blaine, who was widely considered to be very, very corrupt. Blaine, B-L-A-I-N-E. James Blaine. In fact, he was considered to be so corrupt. Remind me, what party was associated with corruption?
Small word.
Party. Democrats were. Very good. And he was a Republican. But the Mugwumps left the Republican Party to go with the Democrats in this one, who was Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland was the former mayor of Buffalo, the former governor of New York, and was widely seen as one of the most anti-corruption candidates we've ever had.
Grover Cleveland.
Grover Cleveland.
So they're both correct?
Do what?
So both candidates are correct?
No, that's not what I said. I said Grover Cleveland was one of the most anti-corrupt candidates we've had. He was a really good guy, it seemed like. I've actually read randomly a Grover Cleveland biography, and it was really good. Grover Cleveland, to let you know, is the only president ever who's won non-consecutive terms. He's our 22nd and our 24th president. But actually in the election where he lost, he actually still got the most unpopular votes. He was really, really laissez-faire. Like, no government involvement. He wanted a small government, very anti-corrupt. And one thing that's interesting about him was he was attacked during his campaign. He had fathered an illegitimate child, right? He was a bachelor forever. And during the election, James Blaine, they were like, they thought they would get him on this. You fathered an illegitimate child.
And
it's, yeah, that's how I did before. He's the one who's like, I did, and I love him. He's my son. And they're like, yeah. Oh. All right.
Did you say he was a, what did you say he was a Republican?
No, Democrat. Remember I said that the Mugwumps and the liberal Republicans left the Republican Party to vote for Grover Cleveland.
What was my dad?
So, if you're ever in politics and you've done something that you don't want to come out, if it does come out, what should you do?
Embrace it.
Own up to it, yeah. Because it eventually goes away if you own up to it. And let me know, it's like murdering somebody. You don't want to do that.
And say you're a born-again Christian.
And say you're a born-again Christian, right? And Jesus is leading the way. You will not lose an election. Ever. You might lose some. You will not. You will win the entire South. Everyone in Texas will vote for you. It depends on how born again you are. If you're really born again, I'm super born. Every day. During this campaign also, the Republicans made a mistake. They started going after Irish Catholic people. They said that the Democrats were nothing but a party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion. They drink a lot, they're Catholic, and you can't trust them.
Good one.
That's Taylor Payton's, that's her campaign slogan. Cleveland won, but though by not that much. And he's the first Democrat in 28 years to win, since Buchanan. Like I said, very, very, very laissez-faire. Did not like corruption, and he did not like lots of government. In fact, guess what he started doing to some of the military pensions? He started cutting military pensions. Everybody claimed that they were in the Army, right? And so everybody's getting paid by the government for being in the Union or having been shot or something. And he started cutting this stuff. He also cut tariffs. The Treasury literally had a surplus. What's a surplus?
overabundance.
Yeah, we had more money in the treasury than we could spend. So back then, the way the government got most of its money was through tariffs. Today, the best way we get money is through income tax. But then it was tariffs, so he slashed tariffs. Smaller government, less corruption, laissez-faire, anti-corruption. He was kind of like a modern-day Republican in that regard. Except for the corruption part. I'm just sort of kidding. Now, we're going to get more into the Dawes Act and the Interstate Commerce Act a lot in the next week. But I will tell you the Dawes Act was an anti-Native American law that actually took reservation land and tried to enforce assimilation. What's assimilation mean? Trying to make them like white people. We're going to get a lot more into this. And the Interstate Commerce Act, we're going to talk about a lot more. This is 1887. These are the two big, only reason I'm bringing this up now, these are two big laws happening during Cleveland's time. We'll come back to this when it makes a little more sense. Interstate Commerce Act, though, is the first law in American history that really regulates commerce. And by the way, does it make sense that that a small government laissez-faire guy would pass the Interstate Commerce Act?
No.
He vetoed it. It was just overridden. When we get into small farmers and stuff, we're going to talk about people calling for more government involvement. Okay? In 1888, he actually goes up against Benjamin Harrison. Who's he the grandson of? William Henry Harrison, right? The guy that was in office for 4 months, or a month, because he had that during his inaugural address, he got sick. This was all about tariffs. Harrison wanted higher tariffs. Harrison won. And the election of 1888, Benjamin Harrison becomes president. He'll be the president for 4 years and lose again in Cleveland. And it was over the issue of money. Okay? We just went really fast. Yes?
Who came up with the Dawes Act?
We'll talk about that when we get into the Western stuff and Native Americans. I just sort of, so like some of these things, like, remember we already talked about the Combines of 1877, we saw it again here. I'm just previewing this. We'll talk in depth about it when we get to it, but that's a good question. Yes, ma'am.
Was the Dawes Act in 1887?
Both were. Well, hold on. No, Dawes was 1880, yeah, that sounds right, 1887, that sounds about right.
And the Interstate Commerce Act?
Yeah, I think they're both during Cleveland's time.
What was the Interstate Commerce Act?
You can stop that. It was the